I want to tell you about the year 1921. Not because it's obscure, not because historians don't know about it, but because of what happened in that single year, what converged, what was lost, what was erased, and because the official explanation for all of it is so tidy, so convenient, so perfectly complete, that I started to find the tidiness itself suspicious. In 1921, the most powerful geomagnetic storm of the 20th century swept across the Earth. Telegraph systems failed, railroad signals went dark, fires broke out spontaneously in switching stations across the northeastern United States. The aurora borealis appeared as far south as Mexico City. Also in 1921, Nikola Tesla, the one man alive who had spent 3 decades attempting to access what he called a natural world-spanning electrical system embedded in the relationship between the ionosphere and the Earth, lost his last major laboratory, lost his funding, lost his property. Died 12 years later in a hotel room, broke, largely forgotten, his papers immediately seized by federal agents upon his death. The official story calls that a coincidence. I don't believe in coincidences this precise. But to understand 1921, you have to understand what came before it. And what came before it is a pattern. Not one event, not two, but a sequence of events spanning 60 years, spaced with what feels, in retrospect, like almost deliberate regularity. Events that the official historical record treats as separate, unrelated, natural phenomena. Events that look, when you line them up, like something else entirely. I covered the first of these events in the previous episode, which I'll pin in the comments for anyone who hasn't seen it, but here's the context you need. In September of 1859, a solar event now called the Carrington event produced the most powerful geomagnetic storm in recorded history. Telegraph lines caught fire. Operators were thrown from their machines by surges of unknown origin. The aurora appeared at the equator, and in the years immediately following, something strange happened to the physical landscape of civilization. Rooftop spires were quietly removed from buildings, architectural elements that had existed across cultures for centuries. Tall, metal-tipped, carefully oriented vertical structures began disappearing from the skylines of major cities. Not destroyed in disasters, not abandoned for documented reasons, just quietly, systematically, removed, replaced with simpler structures, flatter profiles, fewer metal elements reaching toward the sky. I called that removal suspicious. I'm still calling it suspicious. Because 1859 wasn't the last time something like this happened. Not by a long shot. There were more events, more anomalies, more silences in the historical record exactly where you'd expect noise. And each one, 1872, 1904, 1921, follows the same pattern with an unsettling, almost rhythmic precision. That's what this episode is about, the pattern. 13 years after the Carrington event, it happened again. Not with the same intensity, not with the same worldwide reach. But in the autumn of 1872, a geomagnetic storm significant enough to be recorded in scientific literature, significant enough to produce auroral displays visible across Europe, North Africa, and as far south as the tropics. Significant enough to disrupt telegraph networks that had, by then, expanded dramatically across multiple continents, swept through the atmosphere with what one contemporary meteorological observer in Vienna described with evident unease as a peculiar and resonant quality unlike ordinary electrical disturbance. Peculiar and resonant quality. I want to sit with those words for a moment. Because this was a meteorological observer, a person trained to describe natural phenomena in neutral technical language, and the words they reached for weren't powerful or intense or disruptive. They were peculiar and resonant. What does a storm resonate with? The 1872 event, now known among researchers as the Chapman-Silverman storm, though you'll find it takes some searching to locate it in any mainstream historical summary, is remarkable not just for its scale, but for what was documented in its aftermath. The aurora was reported as far south as the Caribbean. Observers in Bombay recorded it. Observers in Karachi recorded it. The storm was, by any measure, a world-spanning event of the first order. And yet, the official historical treatment of it is remarkably thin compared to the treatment of the 1859 Carrington event that preceded it. Why? Telegraph operators across Europe and North America reported the familiar anomalies: surges, disruptions, spontaneous transmissions. We've come to expect those in any account of geomagnetic disturbance because the telegraph is the visible, documented, officially acknowledged system that interacted with these events. But in 1872 there are other accounts, scattered, inconsistent, the kind of accounts that don't make it into official scientific literature because they lack the institutional framework to be reported through. A municipal administrator in Florence, whose correspondence has been partially preserved in a local historical archive, wrote to a colleague describing what he called a vibration in the ironwork of the Civic Tower that lasted, by his estimate, several hours during the height of the storm. He describes it as unprecedented. He describes the building's caretaker reporting the same sensation in the internal structure of the building, a hum felt in the walls, in the metal fixtures, in the chandeliers. He doesn't know what to make of it. Neither do I. But I find myself asking, if the atmosphere was charged enough to run telegraph wires without a battery, which is documented, what was it doing to every other metal structure across the earth? Every spire, every copper finial, every elaborate rooftop element on every church and civic hall and university building from London to Lahore? We don't know, because almost no one recorded it, and the few who did record it did so in private correspondence that survives only by accident in archives that no one has systematically searched for exactly this kind of account. The silence was deafening. But here's what I can document. In the decade following the Chapman-Silverman storm, the late 1870s and into the 1880s, the rate of renovation of major civic and ecclesiastical buildings across Europe and North America accelerates measurably. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself as unusual at the time, but when you go through municipal records, church restoration accounts, university building histories across Britain, France, Germany, and the eastern United States, the removal or simplification of rooftop architectural elements shows a clear uptick in the years immediately following 1872. Was that a response to damage? Was it urban modernization? Was it something else entirely? The documentation doesn't say, and that's the problem. The documentation almost never says. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I want to be precise about what I'm pointing to here. I'm not claiming that every building renovation in the 1870s was part of a coordinated program. I'm not claiming that the Chapman-Silverman storm caused catastrophic damage to some hidden energy infrastructure. I'm pointing to a pattern, a correlation between atmospheric events and the subsequent quiet disappearance of specific architectural features that appears in 1859, reappears in 1872, and then reappears again, more dramatically, in two more events that I haven't gotten to yet, a pattern that repeats with unsettling precision. And I'm asking the question that the official historical literature doesn't seem interested in asking: what exactly was on those rooftops? And what happened to it? Because the buildings themselves aren't what disappeared. The buildings largely survived. It was specific elements of the buildings, the vertical metal elements, the rooftop conductors, the elaborate finials and spires that connected the highest point of the structure to the sky. Those are what were removed. Those are what were simplified. Those are what were quietly, without fanfare, without documentation, without any recorded explanation that holds up to scrutiny, taken down. Not the walls, not the foundations, not the windows or the doors, the things that reached upward. This raises a simple but critical question. What are you afraid of when you remove the things that reach toward the sky? Now I want to tell you about something that I genuinely could not explain when I first encountered it. February 7th, 1904, Baltimore, Maryland. Shortly before 11 o'clock in the morning, a fire broke out in the basement of a dry goods warehouse on Jermyn Street. Within hours, it had become one of the most destructive urban fires in American history, burning for over 30 hours, consuming more than 1,500 buildings across 70 city blocks, causing damage equivalent to billions of dollars in today's terms. The Great Baltimore Fire. Officially, an accidental warehouse fire exacerbated by inadequate firefighting infrastructure and high winds. That's the official story. And on its face, it's adequate. Fires happened in 1904. Wooden construction, gas lighting, limited firefighting capacity. The fire itself isn't suspicious. What's suspicious is what happened to the telegraph and early telephone lines in Baltimore in the minutes before the fire was reported. Multiple operators working for different companies at different stations in different parts of the city documented the same anomaly. Every line active in that window transmitted simultaneously a signal that no operator had sent. Not a surge, not a disruption, a signal. Structured enough that operators on both ends of multiple lines attempted to respond to it, believing a message was incoming. Clear enough that at least 2 operators wrote down what they received, in the way you write down a partial transmission you're trying to decode. What they wrote down doesn't correspond to any recognized telegraph code in use at that time. I want you to hold that. Every active line, simultaneously. A structured signal. Before the fire. The official investigation into the Baltimore fire, which was extensive and which produced a report of considerable length, addresses the telegraph anomaly in exactly 1 paragraph, attributes it to electromagnetic interference from the approaching fire's heat, and moves on. Heat from a fire that hadn't started yet. At the time of the telegraph anomaly, the fire was in a basement. It had not been reported. No alarm had been raised. The fire department had not been called. The event that was supposedly producing enough electromagnetic interference to affect every telegraph line in Baltimore simultaneously was, at that moment, a small, undetected, unreported fire in a basement. The official explanation collapses here. And here's the strangest part. The same day, February 7th, 1904, there are documented reports of anomalous telegraph behavior in cities in Europe and South America. Not identical in content, but structurally similar. Unexplained simultaneous signals on multiple lines. Operators across different countries reporting the same kind of structured, unattributable transmission within the same general time window. The records are scattered, the records are incomplete, but they exist in the archives of telegraph companies and in the operational logs of communications operators in England, in Germany, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Japan. In simultaneous anomalous transmissions, no geomagnetic storm recorded for that date, no solar event in the official record corresponding to February 7th, 1904. No storm, no solar event, no official explanation at all. The deeper I went into this particular anomaly, the more the silence of the official record became its own kind of answer. What was Baltimore transmitting? That's the question I can't shake. Not what disrupted the lines, not what caused the interference. What was being transmitted? Who or what was sending a structured signal on every active telegraph and early telephone line in a major American city simultaneously? And why did the same kind of structured, simultaneous, unattributable signal appear on lines across 3 continents that same day? The evidence suggests something much larger than simple electromagnetic interference. Because here's what I kept coming back to. By 1904, the telegraph network wasn't just wires strung between poles. It was a world-spanning system. Undersea cables connected continents. Major cities were nodes in a network that spanned the world. And that network, that world-spanning web of metal conductors running from city to city, continent to continent, was, structurally, the most extensive conductive web that human civilization had built, since whatever had come before. What if something was trying to use it? What if something, some charge, some stored energy, some remnant of a system that had been disrupted but not entirely erased, was pushing through every available conductor looking for a path? And what if the buildings still standing in Baltimore, with their original 19th century architectural elements, their rooftop metal structures, their internal conduits and fixtures, what if some of those buildings were still, in some diminished capacity, part of something? I'm not saying the fire was deliberate. I'm not saying a cabal started a warehouse fire to cover up a signal they didn't want decoded. I'm asking what it would mean if the fire and the signal were connected in a way we don't have language for. If the last discharge of something enormous and old went through every conductor it could find, in every city it could reach, and the heat of that discharge started a fire in a building whose internal metal network was still intact. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Not in 1859 alone, not in 1872 alone, not in 1904 alone. 3 events, 3 anomalies, 3 silences in the official record where something should be documented and isn't. And then 1921. Before I get to 1921, I need to talk about Nikola Tesla, not the Tesla of the mythology, not the tragic genius victimized by Edison and Westinghouse, though that story is true enough. I want to talk about what Tesla was actually trying to build, because I think we've been handed a very incomplete picture of his work, and the incompleteness is deliberate. By the early 1900s, Tesla had become convinced, through experiment, through observation, through what he described as decades of careful study, that the Earth itself was an electrical conductor of extraordinary capacity, that the atmosphere between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere functioned as a kind of natural capacitor, storing and transmitting electrical energy on a world-spanning scale, that this system was not theoretical, that it was real, that it was already there. His Wardenclyffe Tower, the structure he began building on Long Island in 1901 and that was never completed, wasn't designed to generate electricity. It was designed to access electricity that was already present, to tap into what Tesla called, in his own writings, the wheelwork of nature. That phrase has always stopped me. The wheelwork of nature, not a natural phenomenon to be harnessed like wind or water, a wheelwork, so a mechanism, a system already in operation, already turning, already producing energy that, in Tesla's view, could be accessed by anyone with the right equipment, available to everyone, requiring no fuel, no metering, no central generating station, no infrastructure of ownership. Free. And here's the question that the official history of Tesla's career doesn't ask clearly enough. Where did this idea come from? Tesla was a rigorous experimenter. He didn't theorize without evidence. When he became convinced that a worldwide atmospheric energy system existed, he was convinced by something. By observation, by data, by perhaps a body of prior work, not his own, that pointed toward this conclusion. He spoke, in his late writings, about recovering lost knowledge, about systems that had existed before the current era of science. He wasn't precise about this. He was often elliptical, careful, clearly aware that these claims would damage his credibility in ways he couldn't afford. But the theme recurs, the sense that he was discovering something that had been known before, something that had been lost, something that the world had once had access to and no longer did. What had been lost? The deeper I went into the architectural and engineering records of the centuries before Tesla, and we're talking about a pattern that shows up in pre-industrial construction across cultures, across continents, across periods that had no documented contact with each other, the more I kept arriving at the same configuration. Tall vertical structures, metal at the apex, internal conductive networks connecting the roof to the building's interior, geometric orientations that went beyond the requirements of religion or aesthetics, the same functional logic appearing in medieval European cathedrals, in pre-Columbian temples in the Americas, in ancient Southeast Asian religious structures, in the grand civic buildings of the early 19th century. The same logic. Across cultures, across centuries, without any central authority that we've preserved a record of. What were they all accessing, and why, in the decades after 1859, did the buildings that embodied this logic start disappearing from the skylines of the world? Tesla knew something was gone. He spent his life trying to get it back. And in 1921, the year of the last and most destructive geomagnetic storm of his era, he lost everything. That's not a coincidence, I can argue away. May 13th through 15th, 1921. A geomagnetic storm swept the Earth with a ferocity that scientists today estimate may have approached the scale of the 1859 Carrington event. The aurora borealis appeared over Cuba, over Central America. Reports from observers in Australia describe an aurora australis of extraordinary intensity. In Sweden, the night sky reportedly turned so red that residents called the fire department, believing a massive fire was burning somewhere beyond the horizon. The official name for this event, the solar storm of 1921, sometimes called the New York Railroad Storm, centers the story once again on the most visible and documented technological system of the era. Telegraph lines across the northeastern United States failed simultaneously. A fire broke out in the telegraph room of the New York Central Railroad's control building in Manhattan. Switchboards burned in several northeastern cities. Railroad signals across a significant portion of the network went dark, halting traffic. These are the documented effects. These are the effects that made it into the newspapers and the official scientific record. But I want to ask, as I've asked about every one of these events, about the things that weren't documented, about the systems that weren't officially acknowledged, about the buildings, the still standing, not yet renovated, still carrying their original rooftop elements, buildings of 1921, and what happened to them during those May nights when the sky was red from pole to equator. We don't know. We have almost nothing. But here's what makes 1921 different from 1859, from 1872, from 1904. By 1921, the process of removing and simplifying the architectural elements that I've been tracking was substantially complete in most major cities. The great renovation waves of the 1860s, the 1870s, the 1880s and 1890s had done their work. The elaborate rooftop systems of pre-1860 civic architecture were largely gone from the skylines of London, Paris, New York, Chicago. What remained were the survivors, buildings that had escaped renovation for one reason or another, buildings in smaller cities and towns, buildings on old institutional campuses that hadn't yet been modernized. Which means that in 1921 the storm hit a world that was already different from the world the 1859 storm had hit. A world where most of the infrastructure that might have interacted with it, whatever that infrastructure was, whatever it was doing, had already been removed, but not all of it. And in the aftermath of the 1921 storm, the renovation pace accelerates again, quietly, without drama, without any official announcement that a geomagnetic event had prompted a new round of architectural simplification. But when you look at the building records, the city planning documents, the institutional renovation logs, the ecclesiastical building histories, the pattern is there. Another pulse of removal, another wave of simplification, another round of taking down the things that reach toward the sky. The last major pulse. Because after 1921 the pattern stops. Not because the buildings are gone, some survive, in isolated pockets, in older neighbourhoods, on the campuses of institutions that valued their historical architecture for aesthetic rather than functional reasons. But the systematic removal, the organised if undocumented programme of architectural simplification that I can trace from 1859 through the early 1920s, that stops. It stops because, I believe, the work was finished. Whatever was there to remove had been removed. Now consider the timing again. 1921, the most powerful geomagnetic storm since 1859, the last major disruption of whatever electrical relationship existed between the built world and the atmosphere. And simultaneously, not years later, not decades later, simultaneously, in the same year, Nikola Tesla's last funded research effort collapses. His Wardenclyffe Tower had been demolished years earlier, in 1917, ostensibly to pay debts. By 1921, his attempts to secure new funding for atmospheric energy research, the research that built directly on his conviction that a natural worldwide electrical system was accessible to anyone, had failed completely. He was 75 years old. He had no laboratory. He had no support. He had no institutional home. The man who came closest in the official scientific record to articulating what the pre-1859 architectural tradition may have been doing, the man who spent decades trying to rediscover what that tradition had known, was neutralized in the same year the last major atmospheric event struck the last remnants of the system he was trying to understand. And here's the strangest part. When Tesla died in January of 1943, in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel, federal agents arrived within hours. His papers, notebooks, technical drawings, correspondence, decades of research were seized, classified, stored. Some were eventually returned to his estate. Some, by most accounts, were not examined, not peer-reviewed, not published, seized. I'm not telling you what to conclude from that. I'm telling you what happened. Let me take you back to the architectural evidence, because this is where the official explanations taken individually seem reasonable. Taken together, they become something else. The renovation and simplification of ornate rooftop architectural elements in the post-1859 period, the removal of the spires, the copper finials, the elaborate metal structures at the apex of civic and religious buildings happened in London and in Lagos, in Paris and in Peking, in Boston and in Buenos Aires, in Calcutta and in Cairo and in Constantinople. Not in one country, not in one cultural tradition, not under one administrative authority. Everywhere. The conventional explanation is modernization, urban development, the natural evolution of architectural fashion away from the ornate Victorian and neo-Gothic styles toward the cleaner lines of what would become early modernism. And I don't dismiss this entirely. It accounts for some of the changes in some places during some periods. But it doesn't account for the speed. It doesn't account for the specific targeting of rooftop metal elements in buildings that were otherwise preserved and maintained. It doesn't account for the near total absence of any documented debate about what was being removed, which is extraordinary when you consider how much documented debate there was about everything else in Victorian and Edwardian civic life. The Victorians documented their debates. They published them in newspapers and pamphlets, and the minutes of endless committees. They argued about everything, except this. Not a debate, not a formal recommendation, not a published argument that the elaborate rooftop systems of the pre-1860 world were unnecessary and should be removed. Not why, not when, not under which administrative authority. No. How? How does a simplification of this specific type, targeting this specific architectural feature across this specific time period, across this extraordinary range of cultural and political contexts, happen without a documented central coordinating authority? Because here's the coordination problem in its sharpest form. Political authorities in 1860s Britain had no jurisdiction over municipal buildings in 1860s Brazil. Ecclesiastical authorities in France had no power over university buildings in the United States. City planning committees in New York had no relationship to the civic administration of Shanghai. These entities did not talk to each other in any systematic way. They did not share renovation programs. They did not issue joint architectural guidelines. And yet, the same thing happened, in the same decades, to the same architectural features. The evidence suggests something much larger than coincidental parallel modernization. It suggests coordination, of a kind that left no record, or whose records have been very thoroughly lost, or whose records have been very deliberately not preserved. And I keep coming back to one question, not who coordinated it. That's almost impossible to determine now. But why? Why was it important enough, urgent enough, to coordinate an architectural simplification program across multiple continents, across multiple decades, across cultural and political boundaries that made coordination of almost anything else essentially impossible? What were they afraid would happen if the spires stayed up? What were they afraid the spires might do? I've spent a long time circling this question, and I want to confront it directly, because the question of why is, ultimately, more important than the question of what. What may have existed, a world-spanning network of architectural conductors, a distributed system of atmospheric energy collection built into the spires and finials and rooftop structures of civic and religious buildings across the world, a system that operated quietly and continuously and freely for centuries before being disrupted by the geomagnetic events of the 19th century. That question is fascinating. It may be unanswerable, or at least unprovable with available evidence. But the question of why the knowledge was suppressed, why the infrastructure was removed, why the entire framework for understanding and discussing this system was dismantled, along with the physical structures, that question has an answer that doesn't require any hidden evidence. Because the answer was being built in plain sight at exactly the same time, by exactly the same civilization that was tearing the old system down. Think about what was happening between 1860 and 1921. The centralized electrical grid was being invented, not discovered, invented. Edison's Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan, the first commercial electrical power station in the United States, opened in 1882. Within 3 decades, electrical utilities had spread across the developed world. By 1921, the model was established, a central generating station, owned by a company, producing electricity that was distributed through wires to paying customers, metered, billed, profited from. That model required, as its foundational premise, that electricity was something you didn't have unless you paid for it. If electricity was something that the atmosphere already provided, if a building with the right rooftop configuration could draw energy from the charged relationship between the Earth and the ionosphere, if this was true, and if it had been true for centuries, and if the evidence of its truth was still standing on rooftops across the world, then the business model of every electrical utility ever built collapses before it begins. This raises a simple but critical question. What is the economic value of suppressing a free energy system at the dawn of the age of metered electricity? The answer is incalculable. The entire infrastructure of the modern world, the utilities, the generating stations, the fuel industries that power them, the transmission networks, the meters, the monthly bills, the regulatory frameworks built around the assumption that energy must be produced and purchased. All of it rests on the premise that energy is scarce, that its production requires investment, and that access to it must therefore be controlled and paid for. Every one of those structures is contradicted by the existence of a working atmospheric energy system. So the question isn't really, why would someone suppress this knowledge? The question is, how could anyone afford not to? And here's where I want to be precise, because this is the most important claim I'm making in this entire episode. I'm not claiming a group of industrialists sat around a table and said we must destroy the Tartarian energy grid. I'm not pointing to minutes of a meeting. I'm not naming names. What I'm saying is something simpler and, I think, more disturbing. I'm saying that the economic interest in suppressing this knowledge was so total, so overwhelming, so structurally complete, that it didn't require explicit coordination. It only required that the people who understood what the old system was, the architects, the engineers, the institutional caretakers, the craftsmen who maintained the rooftop structures, that those people exist in a world where the institutional framework for their knowledge was being systematically replaced, where the new science didn't have room for atmospheric energy harvesting, where the new economics actively punished anyone who suggested that electricity might be freely available, where the new professions of electrical engineering and utility management were built entirely on the assumption that the old system either never existed or was irrelevant. You don't need a conspiracy to erase a technology. You need an economic system that can't survive it, and you need the physical infrastructure to be gone before anyone thinks to ask whether it worked. The timing between the Carrington event and the rise of the centralized electrical utility is not coincidental. The 1860s and 1870s, the decades immediately following the first major disruption of whatever the pre-1859 architectural system was doing, are precisely the decades when the alternative model, the model of centralized, metered, owned electricity, was being developed, capitalized, and institutionalized. Not before, after. As if a door had been closed and someone immediately started building a wall where the door had been, so that in a generation no one would remember there had ever been a door. The silence was deafening. After 1921, the atmospheric energy system, if that's what it was never rebuilt. And I want to be precise about why that matters, because it's easy to say the knowledge was suppressed and leave it there. But the real story is more specific and more interesting and more troubling. The knowledge wasn't just suppressed. The framework for transmitting it was dismantled. Think about how technical knowledge survives across generations. It survives in training, in apprenticeship, in the institutional structures that employ people who hold the knowledge and require them to pass it on, in the maintenance logs and operational manuals that describe, in practical terms, how a system works and what to do when it doesn't. After the Carrington event, I documented, in the previous episode and in the records I've continued to find, the disappearance of specific job titles from institutional records. Caretakers and maintenance staff whose duties, as described in the documents that survive, were the monitoring and upkeep of rooftop systems whose function is never clearly specified. These positions don't get eliminated in a recorded reorganization. They don't get replaced with something else. They simply stop appearing in the records gradually over the following decade or two, as the people who held them presumably aged out of their roles and were not replaced, because there was nothing left to maintain. And once those people were gone, once the last person who knew in a practical, functional, operational sense what the rooftop systems were for and how they worked, once that person was gone, the knowledge became inaccessible in the most complete way possible. Not hidden in a vault, not locked in a classified document. Gone in the way that practical knowledge goes when there's no one left to practice it, and no institutional structure that values its survival. Tesla could theorize about atmospheric energy. He could build experimental equipment. He could describe, in elegant mathematical terms, the electromagnetic properties of the Earth ionosphere system. But he couldn't apprentice with someone who had operated the system. He couldn't read a maintenance manual for the rooftop infrastructure he was trying to replicate. He couldn't visit a working installation and observe it functioning, because there were no working installations left. And when Tesla died and his papers were seized, the last institutional thread connecting the new scientific era to whatever the old system had been was cut. After that, there was nothing to rebuild from. I want to be honest about the limits of what I know. I can document the events. I can document the anomalies within the official record. The unexplained simultaneous transmissions in Baltimore, the peculiar resonance reported by the administrator in Florence in 1872, the architectural renovation patterns that follow each geomagnetic event with uncomfortable regularity. I can document Tesla's conviction that a natural electrical system existed and that the knowledge to access it had been lost. I can document the economic logic that makes suppression of that system so comprehensible, even without a documented conspiracy. What I can't do is reconstruct the system itself. I can't tell you how it worked. I can't tell you what the buildings were actually producing, or in what quantities, or how that energy was used. I can't tell you what the signal in Baltimore was, or where it came from, or what it was trying to communicate. The evidence suggests something much larger than any of the official explanations can contain. But the evidence is, by its nature, incomplete. It's the shape of an absence, the outline of something that was there, defined by what's missing from the places where it should have left a trace. The maintenance manuals that should exist and don't, the operational records that should survive and haven't, the job titles that should have persisted and vanished, the debate about what was being removed that should have been recorded and never was, not the thing itself, the hole where the thing was. And here is what I keep returning to, what I can't resolve, what I don't think anyone can resolve with the available record. Was the system destroyed by the geomagnetic events? Was it dismantled by people who understood it and chose to remove it? Was it allowed to decay by people who understood it and chose not to maintain it? Or did the knowledge simply fail to transmit across a generation that had no economic or institutional reason to preserve it, and every economic reason to replace it with something owned, metered, and controlled? I genuinely don't know, but I know this. By 1921, whatever answer was possible had been made much harder to find. There are things that survived, not many, but some. In the older neighbourhoods of European cities, in neighbourhoods that escaped the bombing campaigns of the 20th century's wars, that were considered too marginal for profitable redevelopment, that were preserved for historical or aesthetic reasons, you can still find buildings with their original 19th century rooftop architecture intact. Copper finials, green with age, still at the apex of the highest point of structures that were built before September 1859 and somehow never renovated. On old university campuses in the United States, in Britain, in continental Europe, there are still buildings where the internal metal framework is original, where the connection between the rooftop elements and the interior structure hasn't been disrupted by a century of electrical retrofitting. Where, if you put your hand on the right wall fixture at the right time of year, you might feel, I'm told by people who've tried, something. I can't verify that. I have no scientific instrument that would confirm it. I'm relaying accounts the way the stonemason in Edinburgh relayed his account in 1864, not as proof, but as data, as another anomaly to hold alongside the others. What I can verify is what these surviving buildings look like when you study them with functional rather than aesthetic questions in mind. When you trace the placement of the metal elements, not their style, not their historical period, but their spatial logic. The height, the orientation, the relationship between the apex and the building's internal structure. The geometry of the finials relative to the building's footprint and to the other buildings around it. When I look at them this way, I keep having the same experience. I keep seeing design, not decoration, not symbol. Design in the engineering sense, a specific configuration chosen for a specific reason, intended to accomplish something specific that I can partially intuit but not fully name. Something that was reaching. For something that was there, something that for a long time may have been reaching successfully. Here's what I know about the world after 1921. The sky is the same sky. The atmosphere still carries its charge. The relationship between the ionosphere and the Earth's surface, the electromagnetic relationship that Tesla spent his life trying to articulate, that the builders of the pre-1859 world may have spent centuries learning to use, that relationship hasn't changed. The physics didn't change. The energy didn't go anywhere. What changed was the world's relationship to it, a relationship that required apparently specific physical structures oriented in specific ways and maintained by people who understood their function. A relationship that was interrupted once, twice, 3 times, 4 times by events that disrupted whatever equilibrium had been established. A relationship that was not re-established because the people who knew how to re-establish it were gone, and the people who would have benefited most from preventing its re-establishment were, by 1921, fully in control of the world's energy systems. That's not a conspiracy. That's an outcome. An outcome that required no secret meetings, no shadowy coordination, no villain to name. It required only the convergence of a natural disruption and an economic system with everything to gain from not repairing the damage. The world's energy became something you owned, something you sold, something you metered and billed and controlled, and the system that had provided it freely, that had perhaps been providing it freely since before the era we know, became something that no one remembered having, and no one asked about, and no one knew to miss. I began this series, this line of inquiry, this investigation into events that the official historical record treats as settled and separate, thinking I was following a historical curiosity, a strange solar event, a fascinating architectural anomaly, a question about why certain buildings look the way they do. I'm not thinking that anymore. What I'm thinking about now is transmission, not electrical transmission. The other kind, the kind that connects one generation to the next, the kind that carries knowledge across time, the kind that fails quietly and permanently when the institutional structures that support it are removed. The Carrington event disrupted something. The Chapman-Silverman storm of 1872 disrupted it further. The signal in Baltimore in 1904, whatever it was, wherever it came from, whatever it was trying to say, suggests that disrupted systems can still discharge, that something interrupted isn't necessarily something destroyed. And the solar storm of 1921 hitting a world that was already mostly stripped of its original infrastructure, arriving in the same year that the last man publicly working to rediscover that infrastructure lost everything, may have finished what 1859 started. But I keep asking myself, finished it for whom? Because the atmosphere hasn't changed, the charge is still there. The electromagnetic relationship between the Earth and the ionosphere that Tesla described, and that the pre-1859 architectural tradition may have been working with for centuries. That relationship is still operating right now over every city in the world, over every building where a copper finial or a metal spire still reaches toward the sky. The system wasn't destroyed. The knowledge to access it was, and there's a difference between those two things that I think matters enormously. If the system were destroyed, the question would be whether we could rebuild it, whether we had enough of the original design principles to reconstruct from fragments and architectural scars and scattered maintenance logs something that worked the way the original worked. But if only the knowledge was destroyed, if what we lost was not the physics but the practice, not the energy but the understanding of how to reach it, then the question is different. Then the question is whether the knowledge can be recovered, whether it's still there in the shape of the surviving buildings, in the geometry of the finials that no one removed, in the notebooks of Tesla that were returned to his estate and may or may not have been fully catalogued, whether someone, somewhere, working without institutional support and without economic incentive, and without the blessing of a scientific establishment that was built, in part, on the premise that this knowledge doesn't exist, whether someone like that could find it again. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anyone does right now. What I know is that somewhere in a maintenance log that no one has indexed, in a job description that disappeared from the record sometime in the 1870s, in the cautious puzzlement of a municipal administrator in Florence who couldn't understand why the ironwork of his civic tower was humming during a storm no one had a name for. Yet, somewhere in all of that is the trace of something that was understood once, and understood things can be re-understood. The sky hasn't changed. The atmosphere still holds its charge. The spires that survived are still reaching. The question is whether anyone is listening.